Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, the Package Tourist and the magical mystery tour called life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is novelist Jon McGoran. Jon resides in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, and in addition to being an editor, teacher, and communications professional, Jon has written over 10 novels, 3 of which are young adult science fiction thrillers, Spliced and its sequels Splintered and Spiked, along with acclaimed ecological thrillers Drift, Deadout, and Dust Up, which are part of his Tour Forge series of novels. In addition to his writing, Jon is also the host of the Liars Club Oddcast podcast, which features authors and other creative artists. Jon, welcome to the show. It's a great honor to have you here. Would you please tell our audience, what is your latest book release and what is it all about?
Sure thing, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm very, very excited to be here. So my latest novel is called The Price of Everything. It is basically a near-future science fiction thriller. So it takes place, 30 to 40 years from now in a future kind of ravaged by climate change and corruption and cyber warfare. The internet is history. There's no more internet. Cash is once more king. And in order to make the economy work, the government prints these super high denomination bills, and there is a guild of elite couriers to move the currency from place to place in attaché cases chained to titanium cuffs that they have agreed to have grafted onto the bones of their wrists. They swear an oath: the delivery gets where it's going, or the courier loses the cuff, the hand, and their life. So the main character is Armin Pierce, who is a courier. He finds his case mysteriously empty, and he has to go on the run from his guild's assassins, navigating a network of oligarchs and drug dealers and private police forces, and brilliant but radical climate activists to get to the bottom of a scheme that could actually change everything. So it's weird because there's a lot of ideas in it, but most of them I can't talk about because they're spoilers. But it is about climate change. It's about geoengineering, about wealth disparity and billionaires and oligarchs and weakening government institutions, and a lot of, there's a little romance, definitely a lot of action, and I think some really interesting ideas.
So is the setting planet Earth, or is it an alien planet?
It is, it's New York.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, mostly New York. Parts of it are in Venezuela, parts of it are in North Jersey. I'm in Philadelphia, and pretty much all of my other books, almost all my other books, are set in Philadelphia in, some sort of either Philadelphia as it is or, a fictionalized future Philadelphia. But this one, for various reasons, ended up in New York.
Okay. Let's talk about, what led you to write the young adult science fiction trilogy, Spliced, Splintered, and Spiked? What are those books all about?
So they are, I had this idea. The previous books, which, maybe we'll talk about, were biotech thrillers, Drift, Deadout, and Dust Up. And I, did a lot of research. I take research pretty seriously for my books. And since all of my books usually have some sort of scientific angle, they end up requiring a fair amount of research. But I was, reading about different gene therapies, and I realized that at some point it will be possible for people to kind of splice themselves with animal genes to alter themselves in different ways. And I was working in Center City near Center City, Philadelphia, near the convention center. And when you go out for lunch, when you're working there, it's a very different vibe depending on who's having, whose conference it is. So if it's realtors, it's one vibe, and if it's evangelicals, it's another vibe, and if it's film directors, it's another vibe. And this one was. It was body modification enthusiasts, so tattoos and implants and that sort of thing. And I realized, oh my God, if when this is available, there will be people who will do it, who will take advantage of this. So the series is set in a near future where genetic engineering technology has kind of matured to the point where it's available on the street as a form of body modification. And there's this subculture of disaffected young people who, for various reasons, some as a protest, some just for a fashion statement, some to, make their parents go ballistic, splice themselves with these animal genes and alter themselves in different ways. And I was writing this, in the mid-teens, I guess, and the politics in the country were getting, pretty divisive at the time. So I realized that there would definitely be a backlash against it. So in the book, the backlash takes the form of a new law stipulating that anyone whose DNA is not 100% human is no longer legally a person. Which opens the door to all sorts of, kind of prejudice and, mistreatment of these chimeras, while also kind of exploring, the reasons why people would do this to themselves.
Now, are there some central heroes, common heroes and characters in this trilogy that keep coming back? Are any central people? Who can you tell us about them?
Yeah, absolutely. The main character is a young woman named Jimmy, who I named after my aunt, both her name and her nickname. I had an Aunt Jimmy, her name was Dimphna, which is a not totally uncommon name in Ireland, but is not unheard of. But we always called her Jimmy, so that's who the main character is. And she starts out as kind of a skeptic. She's kind of skeeved by the idea of people splicing themselves with animal genes. But then her best friend gets himself spliced, and some things go wrong, and she has to kind of take care of him and try to keep him safe. And then she befriends a bunch of the chimeras, including one in particular, Rex, who she really connects with. So those are kind of the main characters, and then there are also a bunch of secondary characters in her friend group, which. It was a lot of fun to write. I really liked the idea. I thought the idea was fascinating, and, it seems to me like almost inevitable that at some point, whether it's in 10 years or 100 years, that will become a thing. And then I had been I'd been toying with the idea of writing young adult novels. And I realized that this, would be a perfect entree to that because, this would definitely be something that young people would be more likely to do than me. So that gave me, a perfect excuse to explore that genre, that category. And it was a blast. I had a lot of fun. It was, the emotions are so much more, vivid and on the surface. By the time you're, an adult or middle-aged or whatever, you're kind of, you're a little jaded, and you've also learned to, kind of, not let things get to you so much. Because you have to. You can't feel so much all the time, or it'll just drive you nuts. But when you're a teenager, all these things are new, and it was a lot of fun exploring that as much as the scientific and social ideas.
Okay, let's now go to your ecological thrillers, Drift, Deadout, and Dust Up. What are they all about, and who are the central characters in that trilogy, John?
Yeah, the main character is a Philadelphia narcotics detective named Doyle Carrick, and it's a lot of it is about genetic engineering or biotechnology, and the first book, Drift, part of the science at the core of it is it's about biofarming, which is basically engineering plants to produce pharmaceuticals. So, which is a really powerful technology that can make pharmaceutical manufacturing much more affordable and accessible, and there's a lot of good things about it. I do kind of still think that we're a little casual about genetic engineering. I think that a lot of it, I think it's mostly safe. Probably it seems like it has been, but it's remarkable to me that so much of our food supply was kind of given over to genetic engineering without any epidemiological tests or studies or things like that. So I think we really, we kind of dodged a bullet there. But it's also about the kind of the corporate power that really comes to the fore when you kind of corporatize and industrialize so much of agriculture. It really changes the economies of it. But luckily for me, it also, gives you a lot of cool ideas to explore. So Drift was kind of about that, about agriculture and about biofarming, the intersection of agriculture and pharmaceuticals. Deadout was more about colony collapse. With the die-offs of the honeybees and kind of different possible causes for that, but also different responses for that. It was a hugely fun book to write and astonishingly fascinating to research, because bees are just amazing creatures. And I actually in that series I wrote a novella between Deadout and Dust Up. Because I just had too many bee ideas. I hadn't used them all up. So it was great. The novella was, one of the things that I read about when I was researching was this phenomenon that happened in France, where all of a sudden the honey was turning bright blue, and nobody knew what it was from. And then, of course, it turned out that there was, I think it was an M&M plant that had a leak in the tank or the pipes or whatever that supplied the blue coating. So it was like this bright blue dye sugar water that the bees were all feasting on, and then going home and making this bright blue honey.
Wow.
So I was able to work that in. Yeah.
Wow.
So. I love, it's a challenge sometimes when you're doing all this research, because you read so much cool stuff. And a lot of it you have to leave out because it doesn't quite fit into the story, and your editor tells you, you're doing this for no reason other than that it's cool. You have to take it out, and they're right. The story always has to come first, but it is. So that's one of the great benefits and curses, is that you get to research all this cool stuff, but you can't use all of it.
John, what led you to write about science fiction?
I was a science fiction kid from the beginning, and I did. When I got older, I kind of leaned more into crime writing for a while and straight thrillers. The first few books that were published, I published under a pen name, D.H. Dublin, and it was kind of a weird story how that came out, because I'd written a book and got an agent. And she shopped it around, and she brought it to Penguin, and they said, well, we like it, but it's not what we're looking for. Could you write a forensic series? And I had not written forensics, and I was not a forensic pathologist or anything of the sort. But I was a science geek, and I was writing crime fiction at the time. So at the moment, it was like, oh, this is great. This kind of combines the crime fiction that I am currently writing, and also the science stuff that I find so fascinating. And I had to do tons and tons and tons of research for that. But it did kind of remind me how much I liked writing, about some science stuff. So, my next series were science thrillers, which in my mind, I don't know what the official definition is, but in my mind, it's kind of contemporary. Everything is utterly realistic and as it is today, except for this one extrapolation of one scientific idea that kind of that is at the core of the book. And then I was just like, I had so much fun with that when I had the idea for Spliced, which I think was really kind of truly science fiction, because it's set in the future, and there's a lot of climate change is a big part of it, because I think that, it's undeniable. And if you're writing about the near future, you kind of have to write about climate. You have to include it in the world that you're building, or solve it in some way. So I started from the very beginning. I remember a couple of things. I remember going to see 2001 at a very young age. I was probably like 7 or 8 or something, and just having my mind blown. And then I also I read this amazing book called The Forever War by a writer named Joe Haldeman, which just really kind of blew my mind. I thought it was great. It was funny and very entertaining. And I actually years later I hosted a podcast for a few years, or co-hosted, and I got to interview him, which was really kind of an amazing thing. Because it was, I think, probably 45 years or something had elapsed between when I first read his book and became obsessed with it. So I remember watching the moon launch. It's like the science fiction future, or some science fiction future, seemed very very close, and I think unfortunately we're living in a different science fiction future, which I think is just as science fiction-y, but not quite as optimistic as I had hoped.
Is it true you work with other writers as an editor and writing coach?
Yeah, I do a lot of that. So I write my own books, and then I do some ghostwriting, and I teach at Drexel University's master's, in creative writing program. But then I also do a lot of developmental editing and coaching and consulting, and it's something I started doing a while back. I had worked as an editor before, in the journalistically, but I kind of. I think I just figured that I had learned enough about writing from and about editing from my editors, from the editors that I've worked with, and from my agent Stacia Decker, who is very editorially involved in my work, which I'm very lucky to say, because she's great. But I've been learning all of this, and it's so much easier to see what's wrong in other people's work than in your own. It's just remarkable that they talk about taking a break from your work and coming back to it after a while with fresh eyes, and that's kind of what editing is like. You're coming at this with absolutely no preconceptions. You don't know what you're trying to say, because that's one of the biggest challenges of being a writer, is like, what you're trying to get across. It's hard to know if you're repeating yourself or hitting something too hard or not being obvious enough. You're being too subtle. Either one of those can be a problem, and being able to look at other people's writing and really clearly see how to improve it. And it makes you also feel better about when when other editors look at your work and say, oh, well, obviously you need to fix this. But also, it's, as with teaching, I think it makes you a much better writer. It's kind of you're constantly reminding yourself of the essentials of good writing, and that kind of repetition, I think, really does get in there and help. So I dipped my toe in it and realized that I enjoyed it a lot. That while it is kind of similar to writing, it's also in a lot of ways different muscles are used, so it can be a nice break from writing. I did a lot of freelance writing for a while. When you're writing a novel, sometimes the last thing you want to do when you're kind of taking a break from it is write something else. But editing can be a way to kind of keep in it, but also do something else and flex those different muscles and make yourself a better writer at the same time.
John, please tell our audience about your podcast, the Liars Club Oddcast. How long have you been a podcaster, and where can people find your podcast?
Well, we're currently on hiatus. We've been on hiatus for a couple of years. We keep talking about getting it started again, but we just got kind of exhausted because we were doing it was weekly for a long time and then bi-weekly, and we did over 200 episodes. It was a hoot. I mean, it was a tremendous amount of fun. First, being able to talk to some of these icons, Chip Delaney and David Morrell and Joe Haldeman, like I said, and just so many amazing writers. We had the privilege to interview, but also it was a great excuse to hang out with some of my friends. So it was there were 5 of us on the hosting it, kind of, or co-hosting, and one of them, a lot of the time it was me, would be like the lead interviewer. Whoever brought the guest on would kind of be the person asking most of the questions, and then the rest of us would just kind of, it was very casual and conversational, we chime in with, smart-ass comments or, or astute observations. I would make a lot of smart-ass comments, and my co-hosts would make a lot of astute observations. But it was great, because we would get to hang out with them and then, meet these other new writers and get to talk to them and ask them about their work and their process and, learn all the, there's so many different ways, there's so many different paths a writing career and the craft process can take. That it's fascinating to talk to other writers and hear about that and kind of learn from what they've done and just kind of learn about all the different ways of doing it, whether that's writing a sentence or a paragraph or a career.
Okay. Have you ever attempted to get Hollywood interested in your works? Do you believe any of your books could be translatable to the silver screen or TV?
Well, I believe that all of them can be. And I have had, I have a couple of books that are, in different stages of development. Some have come very, very close and then not happened. The Price of Everything actually was, there was a very, very solid deal in place, which heartbreakingly fell apart a week before the book came out. But it is once again showing some signs of life. I have been, for the last 4 or 5 years, I guess, I've been, maybe a little longer than that, I've been writing screenplays and kind of, I studied film in school, and there was a while where I thought that that's what I would primarily be doing, and I kind of, went into the publishing track instead, but I had always been curious about it, and then finally, as I said, 5 or 6 years ago, I kind of dipped my toe in and started doing it and realized I loved it. I loved the craft of it and the structure of it and how it's different from writing a novel. There are aspects of writing a novel that I love, but it's a really nice change of pace. There's so much shorter, it's so much more concise, it's so much more about the idea. It's the fact of it. A screenplay in my mind it's really not a finished thing. It's like a recipe, and the dish or the movie is the finished thing. The screenplay is the recipe for it. So on the one hand, it's less satisfying because when you finish your screenplay, first, if it ever gets sold, it's probably going to be, rewritten and revised up and down the block. But also, the actors are going to put a huge imprint on it, and obviously the director will, and, all the people that work on it, will all put their imprint on it, which is part of what makes it so fantastic. But it means that the screenplay is not a finished thing, really. But on the other hand, it's like they're so easy to revise because of that. With novels, because they are finished, everything has to be spackled and sanded. And once you've kind of made everything fit together seamlessly, and then your agent or your editor says, "Oh, you got to get rid of this and this and this and build that up," and you're like, "Oh man," it's like I just finished the second coat of paint and it's done, and now you got to tear it apart and you're going to have to spackle it again and sand it and paint it. With a screenplay, it's just you go in there and you change that bit, and you have to make it fit in, but it's a much simpler proposition. So I think screenplays notoriously are much more iterative than novels are. But those iterations I think are much less painful than revising or rewriting a novel.
Jon, I'm curious about one of your works, The Blacklist. Is it true that it's based on a hit TV show? If so, what led you to write it?
Well, it's based on the TV show The Blacklist, and which is a very fun show. They approached my agent. Basically, I guess, someone involved in the show had read my books, and they thought, oh, this might be a good guy to write this book. So there's like a whole, kind of subcategory in the publishing world of media tie-in books, which are usually either novelizations of movies, that, generally movies that don't start with a novel, or so sometimes they will. It'll be, a movie adapted from a novel, and then someone will novelize the movie that will be, even though it originally started out as a novel. I guess usually if the movie is substantially different from the book that it's based on, stories or novels that are set in the world of a TV series or another IP. Sometimes it's a video game or whatever else it could be. So they approached me about that, and I was like, sure, it's a fun show. I enjoyed that show. But it was a very, very unusual process. It was about 8 months, as I recall, 8 or 9 months of going back and forth with the showrunner on the outline for the book. And then, which has to be very detailed because they want to make sure that there's nothing that violates, that kind of contradicts things that have already happened in the show, or that precludes something that they want to happen or that they're planning for the future. 9 months going back and forth on the outline, and then they're like, okay, great, you've got 8 weeks to write the book.
Oh my.
So that's kind of a crazy process. But in a way, it's great because I don't know if this. Well, one of the things that I've noticed the longer I've been doing this is that sometimes, especially if a novel takes long, and The Price of Everything, I call it my most celebrated work because so many times, I announced to my wife that it's finished, and we, would celebrate it, and then somebody, my agent or my editor, would say, "Yeah, no, it's not finished," and I'd have to go back and revise it yet again. But it's a lot to keep the whole novel kind of uploaded into your brain so that you're kind of cognizant of the whole thing. And especially if you're writing over time, then, it's like if you wrote chapter 1, 2 years ago or 5 years ago, it's hard to keep that, fresh in your mind as you're writing chapter 17 or whatever. So it was kind of awesome, exhilarating, and exhausting to kind of be just living in the writing of that first draft and not really doing or thinking about anything else for 8 weeks and just plowing through it, having a really detailed outline. I'm a big outliner anyway. I love to have a pretty hefty outline before I start writing first draft. But yeah, it was kind of awesome. I mean, it was a real challenge, and I think that there are parts of it that definitely would have been better if I'd had more time. But I think definitely that there are aspects of it that probably would have been lesser if I hadn't been just like eating, sleeping, and breathing that novel for 8 weeks.
Okay, Jon, let's talk about you now. Where were you born and raised?
I've lived in Philadelphia all my life. I was born and raised in the Mount Airy section, which is this very lovely, progressive, integrated, tree-lined section of, a lot of old stone houses. And I worked at a food co-op there for a long time, and, which was like at the epicenter of Mount Airy. So it was great. And I live, just outside of the city, a few miles away right now.
Where'd you go to school and college?
I went to Central High School, which I believe is America's oldest public high school. It's this very, story magnet high school in Philadelphia, where, for years they would graduate 2 classes a year. So I was in the 240th class, which was a long time ago. I think they're they're probably up to 290 or something now, which is horrifying to think about.
Yeah.
And then I went to Temple University, which is, this great, large, mostly commuter. When I went there, it was very largely commuter. I think it's a lot more residential now.
Yeah.
Go Owls.
Yeah. Jon, whenever I interview an author on my show, I always love to ask the standard question: who were your favorite authors when you were growing up? And of those favorite authors, did any of them light the spark inside you to become a writer, or perhaps influence your writing style?
Yeah, absolutely. There were definitely a bunch. Joe Haldeman, who I mentioned earlier, was absolutely one of them. As I said, I was a science fiction kid, so I started out reading Arthur Clarke and Asimov and Heinlein and all the kind of the greats, and then as I got a little bit older, I discovered Philip K. Dick, and really, really got into that. Loved that. When I was, I'm a bit of I guess I was a curmudgeon at a young age, because one of the things that kind of turned me off of science fiction, didn't really turn me off of it, but led me to read other genres, was I've never been a big fantasy writer or reader. And it used to bug the hell out of me when I would go to the library or the bookstore, and it was the fantasy and science fiction section. And I would get out a bunch of books that, especially after I had, read all of the books that I knew were science fiction. And then I would be like, oh, well, let me try this. And I would be led to believe it was science fiction. And then I would get home, and all of a sudden there's wizards and dragons. And I was like, it would just annoy me. So I started reading more. My dad was a big thriller, spy novels, Le Carré, that sort of thing. And I started reading a lot of that. And crime fiction, and I discovered Elmore Leonard, and he just blew my mind. I'm a huge Elmore Leonard fan, and I just I loved his style. I loved his voice, and I loved the musicality of his writing. And I loved how much it was not just that it was fun to read, but you could tell this guy was having fun writing. I'd started, I was a writer when I was a little kid. I wrote science fiction stories when I was, I don't know, 8 or 9. But he blew my mind so much that it kind of brought me back to writing. It's the idea of writing. I was a musician for a while, and as I got older, I leaned into that a little more and kind of let the writing go a little bit. And Elmore Leonard really kind of instilled in me once again, or renewed in me, my love of writing. And I think part of that, I loved his writing, and I wanted to emulate it. But I was like, man, if I can have as much fun as it seems like this guy is having writing these books, then I could have a very enjoyable life.
Jon, please tell our audience, where can readers find your books?
They, pretty much everywhere. They're not all on the shelves right now. Hopefully The Price of Everything still is. It came out a little over a year ago, so maybe not as many shelves as it had been. But, definitely bookshop.org, definitely Barnes & Noble, Amazon, any place where you can find books. They're all available most in hardback. I'm pretty sure all of them in paperback, all of them in audio, and all of them in ebook. So however you like to read them, there's an opportunity for you.
Do you have a website, Jon?
Yeah, it's just JonMcGoran.com, JonMcGoran.com, and on all social media, I'm Jon McGoran as well, at Jon McGoran, no H.
Okay. Jon, last question. What will be your next book project, and when can we expect its release?
Well, that's always the big question, So as I said, I've been writing screenplays lately, so I'm a little behind on my book writing. I do have a book called Meathead, which is a kind of a comedic horror novel. Well, we'll see how comedic it is. I'm not sure. I'm still working on it. It's kind of the Blob meets Invasion of the Body Snatchers by way of lab-grown meat, and I think it's an awful lot of fun. But I'm still revising it, and that will likely be the next one. But I haven't even sent that to my agent yet, so that'll be some time off. Yeah, fingers crossed. Hopefully, one day soon you'll see The Price of Everything in a theater near you.
Jon, let me know when your next book comes out. I'd love to have you on my show again. Okay?
That would be great. I would love to come back on.
And if you ever revive the Liars Club Oddcast, I'd be honored to be a guest on your podcast too.
You'll be the first one we call.
Okay, Jon, you take care.
Thanks. You too.
Okay.
Pleasure talking with you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show, where I will be interviewing author Leanne Buss. And I'd just like to remind my audience that my book, Patriarchs of the Dugout, Baseball's Greatest Managers, is available at either paperback or Kindle at Amazon. It's on sale at 25% off and will remain on sale for the duration of the Major League Baseball season. Just type in my name, Matthew DiBiase, MattheWDibiase, or just type in the title, Patriarchs of the Dugout, Baseball's Greatest Managers. Thank you and good night.